I thank you for that reminder, Kathy, and also, again, everyone who's contributing and working behind the scenes. What a blessing. I get to get a first-hand view of that. This morning, we're going to continue on in our study of this incredible sermon that Jesus gave on the mountain near Galilee. So I invite you again to turn with me to chapter 5 as we look forward to, again, another challenge and deeper view of God's law for us, His perfect design for us. We come now to sort of the climax and conclusion of chapter 5, where He's been redefining some of these important commandments for our relational moral law. So we're jumping in at verse 30 in this familiar text, where Jesus says, "You have heard that it was said, eye for eye and tooth for tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. And if someone wants to sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. If someone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. You have heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be sons of your Father in heaven. He causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. If you love those who love you, what reward will you get? Are not even the tax collectors doing that? And if you greet only your brothers, what are you doing more than others? Do not even pagans do that? Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect." Well, as I said here at this final section of this chapter, we come to the climax of Jesus' redefinition of the moral law that God gave Moses in a rather overwhelming and perhaps even more radical way than any of the others. And it's still a little unsettling to me every time I read it, to hear how Jesus manages to go deeper and deeper and expose something even further than the 10 Commandments that we like to tell ourselves that we're at least somewhat good at keeping. By now it should be getting pretty clear that those standards that we thought we might possibly attain are in reality impossible to fulfill. And in case you're still clinging to the hope of somehow meeting this standard of perfect righteousness, I'm afraid to tell you that Jesus has been saving the best for last, hasn't he? In these verses, we can really understand how Jesus fulfilled a prophecy that was spoken of him in Isaiah chapter 8, where this one that was coming to Israel, the Holy One that was coming to Israel, Isaiah says, would be the stone that causes men to stumble and the rock that makes them fall. You see, many have noted that these final statements of Jesus here in this sermon are not only the most admired points of his teaching, but also the most resented. While we love to sometimes reflect on these ideals in our theological kinds of discussions and perhaps philosophical discussions, I'm afraid that when they really come down to meet us at home, where we live, and with the people around us that we would love to hate, I think these teachings are probably the most challenging of all. Which is why, here again, some have turned these principles into some kind of an extreme pacifism, while others have finally said, enough already, and walked away shaking their heads, muttering something about the lunacy of this man named Jesus and his supposed kingdom. After all, what could possibly be right? What could possibly be right about extending an open invitation to more abuse? We all know what will happen if we turn the other cheek to an evil person, don't we? That's right. You're bound to get another blow to the face. And if someone is bent on taking advantage of us, should we really keep loaning them more money? Is this really God's design for flourishing relationships? Even if we don't necessarily fight back, shouldn't we at least follow our instincts that God gave us in the heart of our being to somehow put up our hands? Sorry. Oh, sorry. That's kind of tricky. At least put up our hands to defend ourselves? I mean, that's only natural. And it seems crazy to take on this approach of being what Jesus suggests almost of being Christian doormats. Clearly, if we are to make sense of this invitation to be so radically different, we need to step back and look at the bigger picture and apply some real biblical wisdom for the attitude of the heart that Jesus is calling us to do. The first step in that process, I think, is to understand what it was that Jesus was referring to when he brought up this Old Testament law that those self-righteous Pharisees like to pride themselves in keeping every chance they got. You see, this rule isn't taken from the Ten Commandments like Jesus did in the other first two lessons of this section, but it's taken from the code of ordinances that follows later on in Exodus and Deuteronomy. And in that code, God provides a number of case studies, or sort of illustrative examples, that were intended to guide the judges of Israel in applying his law in all matters of personal injury that were brought to the courts. It's in that context that this familiar standard of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth was to be used as a guiding principle for judges to determine a proper compensation for the person that was wronged. And this principle's been around a long time, and it's commonly known by its Latin name, lex talionis, which basically means exact retribution. It wasn't only applied in Israel, but it was applied more in Israel than anywhere else. And it should be noted that the primary goal or force of this principle was not to give satisfaction to the victim, but rather to protect the accused and his or her family, by making it clear that the punishment had to be equal to the damages that he or she inflicted and nothing more. This rule would stop the violence from escalating further, and it would limit the wake of destruction in its path. And so, thus, it had a double effect. It was to provide justice, while at the same time restraining revenge. In many other ancient cultures, this was not the case. Instead, they would exact a much greater compensation for the damages that were done, almost like the mafia, where the judge might demand that the accused pay back double, triple, or even quadruple fold for whatever may have been stolen or damaged. In those cultures, you didn't just owe someone for the property that you took or damaged. You owed them something for the insult to their dignity, or the pain and the suffering that you caused. Something which we might call the vengeance factor. And it's hard to put a price on a vengeance factor. In many cases, the price for that vengeance factor that was applied was so high that it meant the accused would actually end up living a life of slavery to the person to whom they were bound. So much was the price that they would never be able to pay it back. And so rather than living in community or harmony, it inflicted sort of this added wound of slavery. And it was this Old Testament law that Jesus refers to that was intended to prevent this kind of escalation. You see, it would prevent an escalation of violence or animosity and generational hatred that would often be fueled by these kinds of often unrealistic and unfair judgments. You know, when I think back to the story of the Hatfields and the McCoys and the vengeance of feud that came between those two families, apparently it all started over someone stealing a pig. And it ended up in bloodshed, way too much bloodshed. And so that's what this law was intended to stop. But Jesus does something incredible here. As Jesus brings back to call that, or recalls that law, which was supposed to restrain revenge, he tells us to go further, much further. And so what does Jesus' principle teach us? Instead of the principle of lex talionis, Jesus gives us a principle of active restoration. You see, it's amazing, isn't it, how these suggested examples that Jesus gives are all about taking initiative. They're about sort of regaining our control over the situation by doing something unsuspected, something that would never come to mind to our enemy, because instead of trying to get revenge, we're trying to get restoration. And I want to make it clear here that this is not a rule or principle of pacifism. First of all, it's not pacifism because it had nothing to do with the legal courts. This was not a principle that was to be applied to the ruling authorities, as in the law enforcement people or the officials of the courts. This was a principle that was only to be applied in our personal relationships, in the ways that we respond when we can, in a way that does not bring harm to any others. You see, Jesus isn't telling us here to turn the cheek of anyone else. He's just saying, let's turn our own cheek when we get the opportunity. Let's go the extra mile when we have the opportunity, instead of forcing someone else to do it. You see, the courts and the police and all of those that are given the role of protecting us have an office. And this is not about changing the role of our legal offices or government offices. It's about changing the attitude of our heart in our personal relationships, so that, yes, even a police officer who is called in duty to open fire can still do so in a way of love when he visits that person and that person's family, in a way of trying to restore them to, again, the dignity that we're all desiring. So I want to make it clear that Jesus is only talking about our personal relationships here, and not about a governmental or policy of pacifism. But it's also not pacifism because of what it does for us as people. This isn't about just complying, somehow laying down and taking a posture of, okay, hit me again, hit me again, hit me again. In fact, to do so would also be against God's law, as it would actually bring further harm to us and perhaps to our children or our generations or our community around us. No, this is not an open invitation to unrestrained abuse. But what this is a call to subversive assertiveness. It's a way of taking an active approach when we are able, when we can see the benefit of regaining control of a situation, to take away the fuel of the fire of anger that is in our enemy. It's such an incredible principle, really, when Jesus sees it applied in his own life to those that we see in his story time and time again, like tax collectors, prostitutes, and those who many would feel had betrayed their people. And Jesus invites them in a way that is surprising and is so gracious in his hospitality and his generosity. And you know, what's really interesting is that many think this is a completely new rule that has never been said before. When in fact, Jesus is just reapplying something that God intended for his people of Israel all along. Many times in that old code of ethics, Jesus or God gave case studies about how if one of your enemy's oxen or donkeys happened to escape from his ranch and wind up on yours, guess what? It wasn't somehow a license for you to take that and say, hey, finders, keepers, losers, weepers. Already there in the Old Testament, the precedent was set that you were to bring that property back to your enemy, to restore it to him, and show that that person too had dignity for property and everything else. And Solomon, in all of his wisdom, Solomon understood this principle too. And he gives this incredible verse in Proverbs 25:22, where if your enemy is hungry, give him food to eat. If he's thirsty, give him water to drink. For it's in those opportunities that you will heap burning coals on his head, and the Lord will reward you. Now it's kind of comical the way Solomon says that by doing these things you will actually be inflicting pain on your enemy. But it's not a pain out of a desire of vengeance. It's rather a way of confronting the ignorance or confronting the hostility that our neighbor has that sees us as something of a threat. And so if we want to change their perspective about who we are, that we are no longer a threat to them, how wise is it that we turn things around and surprise them with our generosity and our hospitality? You see, this principle of active restoration is all about the value of relationships, and especially about the value of our relationships in view of our relationship to God, which must somehow create the lens or the way that we approach every one of our neighbors. No longer can we view our neighbors, once we have been transformed by the grace of God, to see them as simply another part of our kingdom-building plan, where now they are nothing more but an enemy or an obstacle on the way to our gaining control over life. Because our control and our future was a dead end until God's grace infused us, until his forgiveness changed our future forever to see that we now have an eternal future. The curse of sin that was placed on every one of us was taken away when Christ forgave us. And those people on that mountainside had experienced it. At least many of them had. They had experienced the life-transforming power of that forgiveness in a way that blew their mind. Or in that culture where they were so outside of any hope of righteousness, Jesus suddenly says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest." And they felt it. And so it's in that relationship that we have with God that we are now given a new perspective about all of those around us as potential brothers and sisters for eternity. And so Mother Teresa had such an incredible understanding of that. You know, we often think there's a pragmatic reason for us to follow this principle. That, you know, okay, if I follow this rule of Solomon here, I'm going to see all of these good things come back to me. You know, the law of karma. Eventually, if I keep doing positive things, I'm going to have positive things come back. Well, guess what? That's not always the case. As Mother Teresa often saw, people are often unreasonable, irrational, and self-centered. Forgive them anyway. And if you are kind, people may actually accuse you of some selfish, ulterior motives. But guess what? Be kind anyway. Because it's not about something that we are trying to gain in property or something that we are trying to gain in status that we're doing this. It's all because we've been given the lens of grace. This lens of grace to view every one of our relationships, even the ones that hurt. And once we've been given that lens of grace, there are some things we can no longer ignore, says Jesus. We can no longer ignore that we have the potential of creating more sons of God. In verse 44, where he goes back again to a principle that he already said in the Beatitudes. He says, "Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be sons of your Father in heaven." Now it's sort of implied there that if you can't do this, or if you won't do this, then I wonder, are you really a son of the Father in heaven? Do you not understand what you are? Do you not understand what you've been given? That you have the eternal inheritance of the firstborn Son of God given to you. Despite the fact that you were lost in your sin. Despite the fact that God had no obligation to give you this gift. God was under no sort of, need to welcome us into that kind of grace. But he did it anyway, because of the potential that he saw for this communion, this relationship that he desires to have with us. And so now, as those sons who have been welcomed back into the Father's embrace, and all of the party has been spread for us here, how can we still look at our brothers and sisters around us any different? He says we now have this eternal worth of every fellow soul that is within these lenses that we've been given, where we can see that they too have a lot of brokenness, just like we did. And within that lens of grace, we can also look beyond the actual sin, the tip of the iceberg, if you will, to see that there is something behind it. There is an origin to this brokenness. There are all sorts of reasons and causes, some generational, some systemic in our culture, some just out of a lack of education and ignorance, and yes, some as a rebellious spirit that perhaps is from the real evil one. And we are allowed to now see that this person's brokenness and pain, including the pain that they inflict on others, is only hurting themselves. And if they could just see the beauty of how God has designed them, perhaps they too could be transformed. You see, the lens of grace forces us to see the potential within each other. And if you have been somehow hanging on to your revenge, as many of those Pharisees were, exacting whatever kind of punishment they could, using the maximum that they were allowed by the law to exact whatever repayment they thought was due them, you have just blurred over that lens of grace in a way that you no longer see the potential in your brother and sister. And instead you have objectified them as someone to satisfy your vengeance. That this vendetta that you are holding, which will never be satisfied, likely, will keep you in bondage. And it will prevent you from experiencing the joy of seeing lives transformed the way that Jesus so beautifully did, as he became the firstborn among the dead, so that he could become the firstborn among those who rise again, as a holy and righteous Lamb of God. You see, the healing that we need always begins with actions of love. These actions of love, the active reversal of every inclination of our selfish nature to seek revenge, or to seek even more than revenge, to seek sort of a vendetta, to pay back double from what the pain that we've been felt, it actually keeps us in the same kind of pain and brokenness that our enemy is likely in the first place. And so this beginning of actions of love, each one of these examples that Jesus gave us, it seems so radical. And they're, again, not to be taken as the complete list of literal ways that we can do this. And in fact, it might even be, again, a bit of hyperbole to just make us stop and think again about what would that look like. What would that look like for me if I were to turn the other cheek? If somebody insults me, which is really what this lesson was about, as someone would slap you across the right cheek, that would be sort of the symbolic offense of saying, I dare you to retaliate, because you're nothing to me. And instead, Jesus says, if this person thinks that I am so unworthy and they want to insult me this way, how will I show them that they are worth something? How will I show them that I actually want to have a relationship with them, that I want to go further with them? That I don't just want to walk away and say, I'm done with you, and actually, like many of us say, to hell with you. The opposite here is to say, to heaven with you, and to say that I'm going to go further with you down this road until we can resolve this. And so if someone wants to take your tunic, you don't just say, okay, then fine, have it, and walk away. You say, you know what? If this is something that you need, maybe there's more that I can do. What more can I give you? If you're still cold, if you're still shivering, have my cloak as well. And we'll figure this out together. You know, there's another interesting thing about this whole passage here in the way or the order that it's presented. Because you would think that the last section would come first, and then this business about the exact kinds of applications would come after it. These active sorts of assertive, subversive actions you think would be the application after what Jesus says at the end, but they come before it. And there's a reason for that. Because you see, there's a lot of times when we won't feel like loving our neighbor. There's a lot of times when everything in us will say, no, I can't and I won't. But it's in that immediate moment when our insult has been felt that Jesus says, immediately, I want you to turn the other cheek. Don't waste any time. Don't think about it and wait a year until you're ready. Love that person back anyway. Because it's in the actions of our love that we might again transform our thinking. Sometimes behavior has to come first. And so when you don't feel like loving your enemy, do it anyway. And again, we may not see any fruit from it. After we apply that principle and try so hard to welcome this person to continue their relationship with us, it's often the case that the person scoffs or mocks us even more. Something about it offends them or angers them and thinking, what are you trying to pull here? Don't pull that Christianity garbage on me. I'm not falling for it. And maybe they even attack you worse. Maybe they look for another way to bring you down a notch, thinking about you're so holier than thou. Jesus says, do it anyway. Do it anyway. Because God shares His common grace with all of us. You see, this lesson that Jesus gives about how God causes the sun to rise on the evil and the good. God doesn't withhold the sun or the rain from those enemies that are against Him. He still keeps showing them His love. He still keeps providing for a future. He allows them to continue in this community that He is calling us into and inviting you and I to be the lights of and the salt of, to persevere. So God is continually blessing all of this humanity around us with His sun and His rain and His righteousness. And in fact, He's already given us more than we could ever imagine in Christ. And so who are we to do less? You see, instead, we carry this principle that, well, God just wants me to show love to my, community, the ones who are good to me. And in fact, the Israelites were thinking that that law applied only to their Israelite neighbors. About returning the ass or the donkey or of an enemy. This idea of giving food to their enemies, they thought that only applied to Israel. But now Jesus is saying there are no limits to it. As God rewards everyone on the planet, so too are we to extend this kind of grace to everyone on the planet. Because if we just do what everybody else does in greeting our brothers, and perhaps giving a loan to a family member, don't the pagans do that? If we really want to be radically different, if we really want to shine with the light that Jesus has given us, to reflect again the grace and the beauty of this community that that has been entrusted to us, we need to do so much more. So much more than what the pagans do. People that don't know grace. We need to surprise them. We need to surprise them off their socks with what it is that this future has given us. Because we are rich. We are rich beyond compare with the eternal future that we've been given. And if you want to know the richest people in the world, look for the people that know how to extend grace. There are so many examples of this around, and I could give hours and hours of examples, but I think probably one of the most powerful ones still for me is that beautiful image in Victor Hugo's novel, Les Miserables. I'm so excited that Oakdale High is going to perform that play here at the end of the year because I love that story of grace and how it transformed Jean Valjean. If you don't know the story, he's destitute in the period of France before the Revolution. Like so many, he's poverty-strucken and everything has been taken from him. And somehow he finally manages to wind up in the rectory of a priest. And there that priest gives him food and drink. restores his wounds and gives him care, and he's eating it all up, but he still doesn't understand it. And before he goes to bed that night, he notices the silverware in the cupboard. Silverware that is worth a fortune for him to get reestablished. And so in the middle of the night, he makes his plan, and he takes all the silverware out of the cupboard and some dishes, and he escapes, hoping that now he can somehow provide. And sure enough, the police find him, and they return him back to the rectory with a bag, and they say, "We found him, we found him. Your silverware is restored." And the priest says, "Oh, I'm so glad. I'm so glad you found him. Jean Valjean, why did you leave so quickly before taking the candlesticks? I told you the candlesticks were the greatest value of all. Why didn't you take them?" And so he tells his partner's nun to get the candlesticks and throw them in the bag, and he basically tells the police, this man is blessed to go and start again. And then he says this important word to Jean Valjean. He says, "Remember, and don't forget, that I'm giving you back to God." Giving you back to God. You see, vengeance is not ours, saith the Lord. It's not ours to have revenge. And when we do, it just destroys us and keeps us prisoners. But when we give our enemies back to God, we free them and we free ourselves for the future of relationship and community that God desires us to have. And how tragic is it when we hang on to our need for justice in a way that keeps us prisoners. Brothers and sisters, who is it that you need to show surprising grace to? Who is it that you need to give an assertive reaffirmation again of the love that you have for them, instead of thinking that you are righteous in your indignation? May we really become the radically different people of light and salt that Jesus has redeemed us to be, and transform this world for him. Will you pray with me? Heavenly Father, I thank you again for this challenging work. Father, for the ways that you call us to do things that are so radical and yet so powerful. Father, I pray that in our weakness, you would meet us again to do things that are beyond our imagination. Lord, as you call us to forgive, to be hospitable, to serve in ways that would blow our neighbors' minds. And Father, forgive us for our weakness. Take away that curse of anger that we're holding on to. Lord, as we give it up this morning and pray again for your forgiveness for all the ways that we have held on to our grudges. Father, by your Holy Spirit, transform us and give us those opportunities to turn them into something beautiful for you. And all God's people said.